Good evening, everybody. I hope everyone is having a great evening. I apologize for not doing a cast last week. It was a long week and I had some long nights and just wasn't able to get it done. So we are going to continue on our Gramlich-Bliley journey through tonight's episode, and tonight we're going to be talking about vendor management. This is something that was specifically a request by someone I was talking to here recently, and this is something I really enjoy doing. I teach a class at this at our local B-Sides conference. I have spoken about this many, many times. In fact, a good portion of this or a portion of this I teach in my class at a local community college when I teach cybersecurity for small business. So vendor management, contract management is it's a big topic, and of course we've only got 45 minutes or so tonight, so we're not going to cover everything, but I hope to give you some tidbits. So let's jump over to the get everything set up here. Let's jump over to the PowerPoint that we're otherwise working through on Gramlich-Bliley. So we've covered several of these things. We've covered risk assessments, data life cycle. We've covered data flow diagrams. We're doing maintain review logs of the user. I felt like this was kind of the natural next step is vendor management, and you can see that it is one of those requirements that was in the new. Let's skip ahead. The new Gramlich-Bliley guidelines, and it's important for every organization. There's a lot of pieces that people don't do. They don't know they can do. In fact, I was at a conference a couple of weeks ago. I was doing a presentation, and one of the students that was in my B-Sides class, this most previous B-Sides, he had come up to me, and we were talking, and I was asking how he was doing, but he was telling me about his experience with vendor management after the class, and that they've built a whole new vendor management process, how to do their checklists and all the things that they do, and that's a huge addition to what they were currently doing. And it's been great. He says that he's made a lot of changes. He's done a lot of redlining. It's really put them in a much better spot. Well, and that was one of the things that was specifically why I believe Gramlich-Bliley put that in their new guidelines. Vendor management is extremely important in what we're doing in our organizations. So I'm going to jump back out of this for just a second, and I'm going to actually go through a different PowerPoint presentation. And this is actually my PowerPoint presentation I do. I believe I did this one. Can't remember now. It was probably I think this is a one-off. This was an organization reached out to me first, and they asked me to do this because this was in a slightly different form than I teach the class, and they needed it within that hour to 2 hour time frame. So what I've done is I've taken that and I've kind of modified it just a little bit for what we're doing now. So this is our vendor and contract management for IT security. So the way I designed the course in B-Sides is this is for IT management, IT leaders. These are people who deal with vendors and contracts every day. And they assist, usually, their purchasing department and their general counsel's office in doing these vendor agreements. And that's really important because a lot of times your purchasing department and your general counsel don't know the technical pieces that are in the contract, so they rely on the IT people and IT security people to tell them what they need to know or tell them what red lines need to make. So in the class, that's what we kind of go over is how do we become an asset to our purchasing department and our general counsel as IT security professionals in dealing with vendor management and contract management. Okay, so this is me. I don't know if I've ever showed this um, on the podcast or on the streamcast. I don't think this isn't everything I've got. This is just what I had in this particular presentation back when I did this a year ago or so. But a good portion of my certifications are in privacy, specifically in privacy. Um, we've got the Fellow of Information Privacy, the Certified Data Privacy Solutions Engineer, the CIPP, the CIPM, CIPT. There's a variety of things there, and you guys can stop the video and read them if you're really interested. But I do this a lot. I've been doing it for many, many years in terms of vendor management and liability management, in terms of contracts, and I realized that there wasn't anywhere that you could go and get information from about these things in the local conferences. So I started speaking about this. Now, I am not a lawyer. I'm not providing anybody consulting services on this in this particular scenario. And everything you do, you need to talk to your general counsel. You need to be your general counsel's best friend as it relates to all the pieces you're going to be doing in vendor management. So I stick this in there just to make sure that you guys understand that you really need to talk to your general counsel, talk to your purchasing department, be a partner with them. So I'm going to go through these slides. I'm not going to go through them exactly the way I would do it in a normal presentation because we're having a conversation here. But why is this important? Number one, it's a requirement of the new guidelines, for one thing. But number two, what we do in our organizations as it relates to IT security is we're protecting our network, we're protecting our services. Fundamentally, we're protecting people and their data and the things around that. So when we have data or we have people have access to our services and systems, it's really important to have IT security wrapped around what they're doing. But we give that data to third parties, or we have third parties come in and work on our networks, or they get access to our system. So we need, as an organization, to make sure that they are also, number one, that they know that they're going to have access to certain kinds of data, whether it be PHI, PII, pick your flavor of data, but they know that they're going to be dealing with that, and they know they need to implement the appropriate precautions around that, or appropriate security controls. This idea of controller versus processor, which is really started out in the GDPR world, where the controller is the person that makes decisions about data, and then your processor is someone who does what the controller tells them to do. So those pieces are really important. I will be talking about that a lot, but effectively, we are the controller. As an IT security professional in our organization, we are the controller. The organization is the controller, and then our vendor generally is the processor. Now, sometimes that changes. Sometimes the vendor becomes the controller. That goes way beyond what we're going to be talking about here. But if we think about, we are the controller. It's our organization's data, that are the data that we have of data subjects for people, and we're protecting it. We are the controller, and our vendor is the processor. And if we look at GDPR, those relationships are very specific, and it's written out. What are the guidelines for the controller, and what are the guidelines for the processor? So that's where I'm coming from. So if you want more specific information, go take a look at GDPR. Do a search for controller and processor, and read through the documentation they have there, because it's really good and it really makes a lot of sense. All right, let's talk about a contract real quick. This is just a little bit of preface for what we're going to be talking about a little bit later. Contract is an agreement between private parties. Mutual obligation is enforceable by law. Those two pieces, an agreement that is enforceable by law. That's going to be critical, because when we enter into a contract, we have to look at that as what is going to be happening, and the requirements of what we have and what the requirements that they are going to have. And you need to have that in the document. They're in the contract. And there may be addendums, there may be pieces, there may be other documentation you add, but you want to make sure you have all of that in there. And what we're going to do tonight is kind of go over some stuff that is surface layer, or just kind of the basics. But the things that we need to make sure are in the contract as the process, or as the controller of the data. You're going to see a lot of these terms out there, and a lot of people. It's a lot of people have these terms. They mix them up. They use them interchangeably. They're not really interchangeable. We've got contract, we've got agreement, we have statement of work, we have terms of service, and we have invoice. Again, I'm not a lawyer. You need to go and talk to your general counsel or external counsel and talk about these things on what you believe these are. This is information that I've pulled off the internet. And it also depends on jurisdiction. It depends on a lot of stuff. But we're going to look at this kind of in an abstract way, kind of a generalized way. Contract is legally binding as long as certain criteria are met. Agreements are not necessarily legally binding. A statement of work is probably legally binding, again, if certain criteria are met. Terms of service can be legally binding. And an invoice is not legally binding. If someone just sends you an invoice, doesn't mean anything, generally. Now, there's a lot of pieces to all this. This is a complicated subject. There are lawyers that spend a significant amount of their time just focusing on contract law, and it gets very, very specific in a lot of cases. But for this conversation, let's just kind of work through these basic terms and these basic concepts. But contract is really what we're going to be talking about today. Now, I love using this particular video in my classes. I actually use this video for both my vendors class and I use it for my incident response class when I teach it. This is one of those ones that when you watch it, of course, this is a Trey Gowdy in dealing with a hearing on the OPM breach. If you want to find it, do a YouTube search on Trey Gowdy OPM. It's really good to watch. It's a few minutes. Looks like it's 6 minutes, 51 seconds or so on the one that I have here. But go and watch it, and let me tell you kind of the specifics. Trey Gowdy is asking a couple of different people. We have a vendor and we have a representative from the OPM. And what happened was OPM had a breach, or they had a data incident. We'll keep it to that. They had a data incident. And during that data incident, there was some things that should have happened. The OPM was supposed to contact the vendor, which is Mr. Hess here. He's a contractor, and let them know that there was an incident, and they did not. And the question was, why? Why did you not do what you said you were going to do in the contract? And there's a lot of back and forth, and it's funny, but generally speaking, what I ask my students after they watch the video is, do you really want to be the person that is sitting there answering questions of why you didn't follow the contract, why you didn't do the things you were supposed to do that was in the contract? And I've never had a person in my classes who said that they wanted to be that person. So it's kind of a funny way to kind of get into this and really look at what the consequences can be if you don't follow what the contract says. So reading the contract, understanding the contract, and following it is really, really important. I cannot stress this enough. Those contracts are legally binding in a lot of cases, and you don't want to be the person that's called in front of a congressional hearing or in front of court where somebody on the other side of that bench says, why didn't you do this when you signed the agreement that you were going to do it, or you signed the contract? So it's a good video. Watch it. And I'm really serious. You put yourself in OPM shoes when somebody is asking those questions of what does immediately mean in terms of immediately contact the contractors. What does a data breach mean? Or, all these different ones. Imagine yourself sitting there getting asked these questions. And then when you go back to a contract, start thinking about what questions are going to be asked of you if there was some sort of incident. All right, so one of the things I make very, very clear is your vendor management is risk and liability management, period. This is risk and liability management. You need to make sure your risk management framework is fully utilized when you're evaluating your vendor contracts. Make sure that all of the pieces are there. But fundamentally, you're doing liability management with a contract. Who is going to be responsible for when bad things happen? This was a couple of years ago now, the first time I heard it anyway. I had an individual, we were at I think it was like a dinner, these vendor dinner meals where the vendor brings out and they show you all the new products, or they let you ask questions or whatever. And we were there, and the individual, they were asking about the vendor management and questions and such. I think it was a lawyer and a forensics firm that was there. Anyway, there was an individual who made the comment that he won't work with any vendor unless they give him effectively root access or administrator access to their network so he can himself evaluate the company's security. And we were all just sitting there, I don't even have the right word, flabbergasted, really, that number one, he would ask for this. Number two, anybody would give it to him. And that is not normal. And we're not really sure that he was actually telling us a full truth there. Anyway, generally speaking, we have controls over our organization. The vendor has control over their organization. And the contract is what develops that relationship between the two. How things are going to happen, who's going to be responsible for what, who is going to do something in the case of a data incident, who's going to communicate with who, and who's going to be liable for it, and who's going to pay for the cost. And that's really what we're doing about liability management is, as a controller, you tell the processor what you're going to do or what you're going to have them do for you. And they, in the contract, will have very specific guidelines on what they should be doing. And if something happens wrong, then they need to communicate in a certain way. And you need to have that stuff specifically put in there so that they will. I had an incident years ago where we were supposed to be notified within 3 days of a vendor having an incident, and it took them several months. And I was very fortunate enough to be able to get onto the line. It was on a Zoom call with the CISO there, and with their lawyers, with our lawyers, with their vice president or whoever, whatever his title was. And it was very interesting when they talked about the 3 days, because we specifically asked them, why didn't they tell us why they didn't report it within the time frame that they stated in their contract, that it was their contract. They did not have a good answer for it, and it caused a lot of problems, and eventually their lawyers decided to end the call fairly quickly after that question came up. So it's really important to know and understand what your contracts say and actually follow those requirements. If there's a 3-day requirement, then you need to do that. But it's all about liability management. Who is going to be liable for these incidents and these problems? All right, when you are doing vendor contract management, of course, you've got guidelines and you've got things out there to help you. Of course, ISO, the 31000, and the NIST 837 revision 2, R2. So, you don't have to recreate the wheel on this. There are things out there that will help you on this. These are great resources. You can go out, take a look at them, and really help you build your vendor management process in your organization. Specifically, when we're looking at 832 R2, on page 2, it states that the risk management framework provides a repeatable process designed to promote the protection of information, of systems, and commiserate with risk. So it's part of your risk management process. It emphasizes organization-wide preparation necessary to manage security and privacy risk. This is risk management just 101 here. And that's what we're talking about. Again, your vendor management is part of your risk management framework. And that's what the NIST 832 R2 is really getting across is, this is risk management. And that's what it is. So, what is the ultimate goal of vendor management? Well, we talked about it earlier. It's protecting your people and protecting your organization. And how do we do that? Well, we're requiring certain things from the vendor or requiring certain things from the organization and putting that on, in a document so you know how things are going to happen in case there's an incident, or otherwise how you're doing your work. How are you getting services or product or whatever from that vendor, how you are providing that. I mean, all those pieces go into play when you are doing your vendor management correctly. All right, so here is when we are talking about vendor management. Here is a quick little list that I always provide to people when they're thinking about this. Number one, you need to know your obligations. What are you obligated to do in this contract? You define what their obligations are. You want to make sure that however they are going to be processing your data or providing you a service, providing you a product, that is clearly defined. What security controls you need. So this would be security controls that you need in your organization. Perfect example, let's say you sign an agreement that you will pass the information over to that organization through a secure file transfer process. Do you have that technology in place? Can you do a secure FTP over to them with a private public key pair? So you need to make sure that when they provide you requirements that you can meet those requirements. You define their security controls. You're giving them data or they're on your network, they're providing you a service or a product. There are going to be some controls that you need them to do. Now, an example of this is like CMMC. So when you have something like CMMC, whatever level you need to be at for CMMC, you need to make sure your vendors are also at that level because they're processing stuff for you. They're processing data or providing something to you. So in some cases, you need to make sure that if you need to be CMMC level 2, they have to be CMMC level 2, depending on what they're going to get. So you may have to define what security controls they need to implement to meet your requirement for a compliance. And then the very next one is defining your compliance requirements. And in my world, in higher education, we meet FERPA and a variety of other ones, but FERPA is a big one. So I want to make sure that every single vendor that I deal with understands we have to meet FERPA. They have to meet FERPA. I have gotten it several times where they mark that out. They redline that in the agreement. And I just absolutely will not. And they say, well, we don't want FERPA data. Well, I mean, that's to use this service, you have to have FERPA data, part of the academic record. So you need to make sure that when you are talking to your vendors, they understand every single compliance that they may be required to meet as it relates to the data they have or the access they have. Access is a big one. We may get into this a little bit later, but keep this in mind. If you have a vendor that's on campus or in your organization, physical location, and they have access to certain kinds of data, they themselves have to meet that compliance requirements. PHI is a perfect example. Let's say you have a network engineer coming in to do work, so they're a contractor. They come in, they're giving keys or card access to the whole facilities to run wires around. They're going to fall under your HIPAA compliance, probably, depending on how you do it. Because they have access to the whole network, they have access to physical rooms. They can get in. There may be PHI on the desk. There may be all kinds of stuff. So these are really important things you have to think about is they have access to this stuff. You need to make sure that they are going to fall under compliance. Now, it may be a BAA with them to be able to do that, or you may have to lock it up differently or whatever, but you need to understand that, and they need to understand that they will fall under the requirements of those particular compliances. Understanding their risks. This is one of those things where in some cases you have to accept risk because of that particular organization. One of the things that we do or that I do is a requirement of certain levels of cybersecurity insurance. a few other things. And in some cases, they come back and they say, "Listen, we can't have cybersecurity insurance. The cost of cybersecurity insurance is 10 times that we're going to make on this in terms of what you pay." So you need to understand what those risks are. You need to understand if you're dealing with this organization and you need to deal with them, they will have certain kinds of risks in their organization that you have to, if you can't mitigate it and they can't transfer it, then you may have to accept it. So understanding those risks are really important. Now, the only way to understand this is ask questions. Ask questions and put together your list of stuff that are requirements, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Now, these are the two pieces: knowing your liabilities and documenting their liabilities. Who is going to do things and who's going to pay for things if something goes wrong? Generally speaking, if you do something wrong and it causes a data incident, you will probably have to pay for it. If they do something wrong and it causes a data incident, they will probably have to pay for it. At least that's how you should write the contract. Whoever's liability falls, they're going to be the ones who are responsible for this. Now, I'll tell you, there's a lot of times you're going to get a contract that has indemnification in there where they state, under no circumstance will we be responsible for anything that happens. The problem with that is if they have data or if they have access to data or if they do a problem, you're going to be, they can cause that incident, you're going to be responsible for that. Had an incident not too long ago where somebody comes in and with a vendor comes in and says, there's no way we could absorb the cost of a data incident in terms of the scale that we were talking about in terms of the data. There's a lot of data involved, and they said we just can't absorb that. And my response to that was, well, then you don't get access to the data. And they were just stunned, like, but we need access to the data. It's like, well, no. I mean, if you can't absorb the risk and cover any liabilities you have with that data, then I don't want to give you that data because I can't absorb that either. So we went back and forth for several weeks on that, and it became very tense because they wanted the data, and this department wanted them to have the data, but they couldn't implement the appropriate security controls nor absorb the risk. We're talking about risk transference, cybersecurity insurance. They couldn't absorb the risk to have that data. So, but this is something that we have to think about. We have to think about as an organization, what is the organizational's risk of them having access to this data? And is this something that we can absorb, or is it something that they're going to have to absorb? So again, liabilities. Who is liable for a data incident or something going wrong? All right. This is something that I use this as an exercise in the class. And when I say, what do you think, when you think about security, what do you normally think about? And I've done this in very small classes. I've done this in huge auditoriums full of people. And everyone always gives me the same answers. Let's see if I have it on the next slide. There we go. So this is the stuff that everybody responds with. When we're thinking about security, what do you think about? And people will say, MFA, firewalls, encryption, compliance, retention, documentation, audits, pen testing, security training, all of these different things. And of course, I always ask them, generally my question back to them is like, no one ever says people. When we're talking about security, we should be talking about people. But regardless, these are the things that people will talk about when we're talking about security. These are the exact same things you should be asking your vendor. When you're talking with your vendor, let's say your processor, you're giving them a bunch of data, you need to make sure that they are otherwise doing these sorts of things as well, because you are going to be responsible, possibly, for any data incidents that happens with your vendor or the processor. So it's a good idea to ask them these questions. Now, I use a tool called a HECVAT, Higher Education Vendor Assessment Tool. It's provided by EDUCAUSE, or a group at EDUCAUSE. And what it is the higher education community got together and says, we need a standard set of questions that we can ask all of our vendors to provide to us so that we can do a true risk assessment against that vendor. The HECVAT is great for that because it's got lots of questions. It's a tool. It's a spreadsheet. It's a big spreadsheet with a bunch of questions. But vendors already have this filled out. They fill it out because one university or one higher educational institution will ask them to fill this out, and then they provide it to the next, and the next, and the next. What we do is we ask them to provide a new HECVAT every year so that we get latest and greatest up-to-date information in it. But these questions in this HECVAT are asking them about this stuff. Do you do encryption? Do you have a CISO? Do you have properly trained people? There's a whole bunch of questions. And these are the questions that I want to ask the vendors. So I ask them for the HECVAT, and then I read through the HECVAT, and I come up with the next set of questions that I'm going to ask them directly based off the information they provide in the HECVAT. That is the process that we go through, and I believe I left the slides in that we talk about that process. But those questions are about these sorts of things. Do you have regular pen tests? Do you do your audits? Do you do security training of all your people? Do you do encryption? It is our responsibility as an organization to make sure our vendors implement the correct security controls as it relates to the requirements of the data or services that they're going to provide to us. Now, we can't make them do it. I mean, I am not going to be sitting on their network evaluating their network scans. Just make sure they're doing it. You put it in the contract and make sure that they understand that they have to meet the requirements of that contract. And then if anything comes up, you go back to the contract, you look at it, you go to court, you go to arbitration, you sue, whatever you have to do for maybe a breach of contract or a misrepresentation or something. But these are the questions that I'm going to ask because I need to make sure that they are doing those things as well. If I want to be doing them, I want them to be doing it because we want to protect the data and the systems and the services that they're otherwise providing. All right, let's talk a little bit about the contract management life cycle. I don't know why this is a thing that people don't know. I mean, they just never really thought about it before, but there are three parts to a contract. When we're dealing with a contract, there's pre-contract negotiation, there's meeting the contract terms, and there's end of contract processes. Now, this is very common sense stuff, and I think, when people say, like, oh yeah, that makes sense, but there's a lot of times they don't understand these pieces right off the bat. So the pre-contract negotiation is the process I do to ask them questions. I ask them for their HECVAT. I ask them for I give them a series of questions to ask, after the HECVAT. I take a documentation of all their stuff on their website or their PDFs or their terms of use or their whatever. That's all pre-contract. That's the redlining. That's the negotiation. That's the stuff you go back and forth with. Then you have, you actually sign the contract. Now you're meeting the contract terms. So you are providing them data, they are providing you services, or they're providing you data, whatever it is. Those are all the middle section of the contract management lifecycle, the meeting contract terms. Then you have end of contract processes. These are the things that have to happen after the contract is ended. And this might be you have to put in a particular document to them saying that we're going to end the contract in 30 days. This could be that you have to ask for your information back before they will give it to you. Maybe there is a cancellation process. You have to communicate to the right people, otherwise you're going to get billed again. So these are the three very specific pieces of contract life cycle management or contract management life cycle that you really need to think about. What is your pre-contract process, what you're meeting your contract terms, and what is your in-contract process? One of the things that just drives me bonkers is people don't go back and look at the contracts after they've signed them. This should be a regular process. Somebody should go back and look at those contracts fairly regularly. Some people will say once a year, and I don't think that that's a good idea. I think that somebody, your contract manager, maybe your systems manager, or your site manager, or whoever is going to be dealing with this contract, needs to be evaluating that contract. Are you meeting the requirements? Are you meeting them, and are they meeting them? Let's say in my contract or my data writer that I have, one of the things that I ask for, or if I'm otherwise doing something with the vendor, one of the things I ask for is an updated HECVAT every year. Maybe you're asking them for their SOC 2 report, their SOC 2 Type 2, or whatever. Is somebody doing that? Is somebody actually asking for that information on a regular basis? So I don't like the idea of they only look at the contract once a year, or they only look at the contract when they renew. You should be looking at that contract on a regular basis. In a contract processes, when you are about ready, within, let's say, 6 months or a year of a limit, ending that contract, somebody needs to be going through that contract and making sure you're doing all the pieces you need to. In some cases, if you do not put the notice that you're going to end the contract 6 months in advance, you're going to get charged another year, and that can rack up. That can really rack up costs. So you need to make sure that you know what is the end of contract processes so that you can do them. It'll save you money, save you time, save you effort. And it'll be stuff, let's say that the only way for you to get your data back out of them is to specifically put in a ticket, request this, and so on and so on. So that stuff is really important. You need to know what your end of contract processes are. During your contract negotiation and agreement, there are some things that you need to do. I kind of talked about it a little bit earlier, where this is the time that you're getting questionnaires like the HECVAT, your informal emails. If you're communicating with a salesman or an account rep or a vendor, you need to document all those emails. That becomes part of your contract management process. All your documentation you need to save. So if you're documenting, sometimes they put all of their policies and procedures on their website. Download a copy, print it to PDF, download a copy, put it with your documentation for your contract. All your websites, communications, the contract itself. I've had times where I go to the department and say, hey, where's a copy of this MSA? And it's like, well, we don't have it. That's a bad day, because then you have to go to the vendor and ask for the executed copy of the master service agreement or the contract, and I have to rely on the vendor to give it to me. Not that I think the vendor would change it, but I want to make sure I have a copy of that. And that protects the organization and also protects the vendor. You need to know when you're going through the contract, there are times in which you need to know the questions to ask. A perfect example, we had a vendor once or a department who entered into this vendor agreement, and there was a whole list of stuff that IT had to provide, and no one had asked IT about it. That was a problem, because there were some things we could not provide, and yet it was in the contract that we were going to provide this. So you really need to have a set of questions that if you're an IT security professional and you're otherwise looking at this, the things you need to ask. Maybe it's about file transfers. Maybe it's about VPN connections. Maybe it's about user accounts, whatever it may be. You need to know what needs to go to IT and what you need to ask from them. Then you get into the negotiation of the IT and data security requirements. Perfect example, you should require that your vendor requires multi-factor authentication for any services that involves your data. If they're logging into the system, logging into a computer that gives it, they should all be MFA. So that's an example of what is the IT and data security requirements. The liability concerns. This is where you're going to talk about your liability concerns with the vendor. And talk about cyber insurance, talk about other liabilities, who's going to pay for what. And then, of course, the insurance concerns. I want especially all of our vendors that deal with our data, to have a certain coverage. This comes from our general counsel. It comes from our external counsel. And we've all kind of, huddled up and agreed on this certain amount is what we want all of our vendors to have in case there is an incident, that they will help us in terms of paying for it if the incident's on their side, if it's their fault. So these are all things that's pre-contract negotiation, or contract. This is pre-contract signing. This is all part of the contract negotiation and agreement. We talked about this before, meeting the contract requirements. So this is after the contract is executed and what you're going to have to do and what they're going to have to do. So the number one, you need to make sure you understand all the contract's terms. What is data? What is a breach? I will tell you, everybody has a different definition of breach. They have a they have different terms for what is a breach versus an incident, or definitions of what is a breach and an incident. They also define user data differently. What is directory information in our world, what is not, what is public, what is not. So you need to understand all the contract terms, because you don't want to have to go to court or a congressional hearing and say, Your Honor, or Sir, or Ma'am, I didn't know what that meant. That's going to be a bad day. So make sure you understand the contract terms. You have a breach of contract. What is a breach of contract? Now, we're not talking about data breach. We're talking about a breach of contract. So if someone is not doing the things that they're supposed to be doing, how is that going to affect the contract? Now, this is where your general counsel is really going to take control over this and deal with this. But you need to know, if they're not meeting the security requirements, that you go talk to your general counsel and you tell them, like, hey, we have a problem here. They're not meeting these requirements, and see what remediations you need to do. And then, of course, data incidents. This is the big one. If there's an incident, when are they going to tell you? How are they going to tell you? That's one of the things that catch a lot of people. They may say they're going to let you know by their website. They're just going to announce it. Well, unless you have someone sitting there looking at their website every day, you may not know they had an incident. So what I do is I have very specific communication protocols of who they're going to contact, where are they going to contact, and of course on the contract should be, when are they going to contact. What is the definition of a data incident? Who are they going to contact? When are they going to contact them? So make sure that they're contacting your general counsel. Make sure they're contacting your CISO, your incident response processes. Maybe you have just a standard email you use for that. We had an incident where somebody had sent a secretary an email saying, hey, we had an incident. Now, what they said was, there was a problem with the server, and it's not a problem, and we didn't lose any data, but this may, you may want to think about this. I mean, they made a very flowery email to them. And I say it like that because they were trying to allude to that there wasn't a problem. So the secretary just kind of like, oh, okay, no problem, and went on. It eventually got out and about, and I got a hold of it, and it's like, they had a data incident. They had a hacker with root access to our data. And they said it. I mean, it was in there that this person had administrative access to these servers. Well, that's huge. That's something that I need to know about. And it's and this was not just us. This was a lot of people out in the world that this was affecting. And, but they wrote it in a way to alleviate maybe some of the concern of the person who got it. Well, I don't want them to send it to anybody else. I need them to send it to our incident response process, or our general counsel, or to me, so that we can evaluate that risk to the university. So that was something to keep in mind. Make sure that if there's a data incident, who are they going to contact? How are they going to contact? When are they going to contact? Because that's critically important. All right, so the end of contract processes. What is the documentation you need that you are ending the contract? What is the data return or destruction policies? How long are they going to keep the data? If they do destroy it, how do they destroy it? What level they're going to destroy it at? If they're going to return it, what format are they going to get? When do you have to request that? All these different things. I read a contract once. We didn't go with this organization, but we went a contract that says any data that you give them, they get to keep forever, regardless if they're in a contract or not. And no, I'm not gonna recommend that we enter into a contract from the organization's point of view that this vendor gets to keep all of our data for free. That's not reasonable. And what they were doing is they were doing research on it. They were collecting the data and then using that to do research or whatever. But that's not why we collect the data. That wasn't why we were giving it to them. And this is a problem when you have departments who go out and find really cheap software vendors or really cheap data processing vendors. And the reason why it's cheap in some cases is because they're getting value of getting your data. So that's something to think about when they have access to your data. You want them to destroy that data. You want to return it. You know, if they're especially if they're processing it, give you the data they're supposed to give you, but then otherwise destroy it appropriately. And you need to have that documentation. All of that becomes documentation in your contract management system, so you know when you requested to have it returned, when they were supposed to destroy it, and the verification that they actually did destroy it. They should send you an email, send you a letter, whatever, saying, yes, we destroyed this at this date. So those are kind of the three major processes of contract management. And like I said, this was a very short video. We're at about 41 minutes or so. And there's a lot to this. We go into a lot more detail in the class. Of course, it's an 8-hour class. I've actually taught it in 2 days, so 16 hours. I normally teach it in one. Hey, when I'm doing this as a formal presentation, I have a lot more. We go over checklists and various other things. But I wanted to make sure that when we're talking about vendor and contract management as it relates to Graham-Leach-Bliley requirements of vendor management, what did that mean? You know, a lot of people they don't think about all these pieces because they've never had to do it. So I took my normal contract management class and really just kind of put in the pieces that I think everyone should be looking at as it relates to your vendors, so that when we're thinking about the Graham-Leach-Bliley, what they want us to do is make sure that if they're processing our data, they are also following the requirements that you have to follow to protect that data. And it could be, again, encryption, MFA, it could be liability, you know, cyber insurance, whatever. But you need to make sure they're doing it. And how you do that is through the contract. You evaluate the contract, and you go through the process of making sure they understand what the requirements are, and that you understand what your requirements are, and your communication protocols, your data incident requirements, all these different things. If you don't do that, then you're putting yourself and your organization at risk. Now, what we didn't cover in this is actually redlining the contract and doing your checklist and looking for stuff. That's just too detailed for this scenario. If people really want it, I can go over some of that stuff. I would say, you know, come and take the class at B-Sides. We sit down, we actually go through real contracts. We go through the contracts, and we have a process that we go through, and it really gives people a good understanding of what they need to do in their organization. This was just a surface layer. You need to start thinking about these things for vendor management so that you can be working with your general counsel and your purchasing director in terms of implementing this in your organization. Okay, that was a lot of information in a very short amount of time, especially about vendor and contract management. I really like this topic. I do it. I live it in my job. I teach it. It's really, really important. It's really important for IT security professionals to know this stuff. There are some classes out there in the world that you can take that covers this. What I find is there is a lot of general counsels and in some external counsels that they don't have a lot of experience in this. So sometimes it can be difficult in finding that right person to be that partner. But you have to ask. I'll tell you this. When I'm working with a vendor, I will specifically ask them for their legal representation, you know, their lawyers that know data security and data privacy. And there are times they come back and they say, well, we don't have anybody. It's like, well, okay, that's scary. But you want to make sure you have somebody. If your general counsel doesn't know some of this stuff, just because that's not what they've done, then they'll usually know a lawyer, an external lawyer that does this every day. So get in good with them, talk with them, engage with them, get where you can use some hours with them. So you really need to have somebody that really knows this stuff and can really help you build your processes in your organization. It's not hard. And I tell you that what I always tell people in the class is, you're going to be your general counsel's best friend, because you're going to know all the technical stuff, you're going to know all the procedure stuff, you're going to know all the policy stuff that you need to do in the IT and IT security side, and you're going to wrap that up in a document for them to read through and modify the contract or redline the contract to send back to the organization. So it's a process. It's not hard. You do it a couple of times and things start clicking. Like, oh, okay. I have probably gone through, I don't know, 400 contracts, and redlined them and sent that to my general counsel so that they could do their stuff. Maybe not that much. Maybe 275, 300. I don't remember now. But it's been a lot, and I do it almost every day. And it's so important that I built a process around it, because I wanted to make sure that I did it repeatable. When we go back to the risk management, they talk about provides a repeatable process designed to promote the protection of information and information systems commensurate with risk. That's what I was trying to do with my vendor management processes, and I wanted to have a repeatable process that I ask the right questions every single time of our vendors and get them to put that in the contract to protect our university's data or protect our organization's data. And that's what I want you guys to do, and that's what Graham-Leach-Bliley wants us to do. And a lot of compliances are doing that now. GLBA, the relationship between the controller and the processor, that's exactly what they're wanting us to do, is make sure that the processor is maintaining the correct information, the correct security for the information that they're getting, the same exact way as the requirements of the controller. So that's kind of where this falls. All right, it is midnight 47, so I hope everyone is having a great evening or great morning now. I hope this was useful. I'm going to post this one out on LinkedIn because I think this is a good information for everybody. And I hope you really take an opportunity to look at your vendor management process and your contract management process in your organization and think about it just a little differently. How can you better protect the people? How can you better protect your organization? So have a great evening. We'll see you next time.